Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Firefighters podcast, where we seek to develop, inspire, and motivate the world of the emergency services operator through a series of wide-ranging conversations. Now, before we go any further, just hit that rate, follow, or subscribe button on whatever platform you're listening to. It's a key performance indicator for us and helps us reach even more people. Now, here's what we've got for you today. Hey folks, welcome back to the podcast. This episode today, we really struggled to think of the right title for it. Because despite how long or short some episodes might seem, we're often faced with the impossible task of fitting decades of experience, knowledge, and to be honest, wisdom from our guests into like 1 or 2 hours of conversation. We have this thing about framing people, about giving them a name or a title or a role, and that unconsciously puts a lot of unspoken limitations on how much you can really take from that person as a coach or a mentor, or just someone to kind of help guide you through your own career. So my guest today is Carl Boasman. Now, after 31 years service, retiring in October 23, Carl started doing a lot of leadership development, a lot of coaching, mentoring, but his career started joining back in 92 with North Yorkshire. And he served every operational role up to area manager. He undertook a wide variety of operational specialist and managerial roles, including training instructor, development center manager, communications and district manager. He led the introduction of fire behavior training and spent a lot of time in Sweden, gaining the European fire behavior training instructor qualification. Then moving into that group manager role, he did several geographical areas and fire stations before moving into specialist roles in HR, health and safety, occupational health, operational assurance. Then in 2016, he was appointed to an area manager where he had that kind of strategic look on the organisation. He was part of the services corporate management board, getting involved for the first time in a lot of gold level incident command. And Carl now teaches and assesses all the way up to kind of senior leadership and gold level. That's where he got a lot of experience around organisational development. Having that long lens, getting stuck into industrial relations, negotiation, dispute resolutions, all those really difficult, tough conversations. And in 2020, he was appointed Assistant Chief Fire Officer and Director of Community Protection with a strategic level responsibility for operations as well. He's done a lot of work with local resilience forums, TCGs. He ran one of these during the COVID pandemic for around 18 months, looking at that response all the way to the recovery. One thing I really found interesting as well was the conversation around cultural change. He actually developed and led a cultural change program to improve workplace health and safety and led on a lot of the national level work for equality, diversity and inclusion as part of the NFCC. But again, when you start looking at those senior level leaders, you forget about their 30 plus years of career and the fact that many of them have been in those sticky situations themselves. Carl reflects on a really emotive incident where he had to make the decision for him and a colleague to don BA sets and try to carry out a subsurface rescue, something that for us, as we are now with our guidance, rules and procedures, would just seem crazy, surely. But it was a different time. And commanders back then were still faced with these impossible challenges, these really wicked problems, where time is on the line and the public pressure is just huge. So today we speak about things like the impact you have on the people around you, on your team, on the wider service, on the organisation, on the sector itself. Are you the sort of person that's going to cast a shadow or cast a shine over your organisation? We go through some great definitions of leadership. We talk about how to think moving into those new roles. We speak about a 100-day plan. We speak about psychological contracts, spoken and unspoken. We speak about the challenges we have with the agility or lack thereof in our organisations and how we respond to some of the changes. We also talk about the challenges faced in mental health, and not perhaps from the generic standpoint that you've probably heard before. So there is a lot to take away from today's conversation. And it's a real privilege to be able to be part of this passing of the torch, changing of the guard, being able to pay forward all of these experiences so that you don't have to relive them all yourself. You can learn the lesson before you take the test, because we are living in testing times at the moment. We don't have the answers for everything. And even where we do have the answers, perhaps we don't have the funding. But there is still movement, there's still wiggle room, and there's certainly a lot of desire and passion to try and continue moving the needle, making our services happier, healthier, more effective. And if you adopt some of the things that Carl shares with us today, I sincerely believe there are some tactical, deployable, personal development themes that you can take away from this conversation. So without further ado, it's a privilege to introduce today's guest, Carl Boasman. I'll see you on the other side. One thing I wanted to start with, mate, people won't know that we've had 2 or 3, for me personally, quite interesting conversations that give me a lot of self-reflection. And I wanted to ask you about one of them, so this is the 3rd attempt, I think, at recording. And I take responsibility for both of the previous failures. And that is because of a subject I'd love us to start on, which is working hard versus working too hard. And you said it just before we came on the podcast. You said about how's everything, how's juggling time. And I think that's like a natural thing you've probably fallen into, maybe intentionally or maybe by accident, through the coaching and the leadership mentoring that you do. But I was hearing, and I sent you a link, didn't I? When we had a quick chat earlier today, a podcast, Dr. Ranjan Chatterjee. I'd strongly encourage everybody to go and have a listen. And he's talking to Dr. Gabamate, I think it is, when he's on the podcast. And it said about doctors having this thing, and I think it reflects on the fire and rescue service and police as well, whereby if I'm not there, what will happen? People need me to do the thing. And we attach so much of ourselves to the job that we do. And I always try and remind myself, fire and rescue service was here long before us and it will be here long after. If I explode in a black hole tomorrow, everyone will be absolutely fine. I'm sure they will crack on as they would normally. Like, people will know from my introduction the different levels of leadership that you've operated at in the UK Fire and Rescue Service. How did you manage that? Because it's some great advice that you've given me in the past. I'm not going to actually try and remember it all, but I'm sure it will manifest itself in our conversation today. How do we strike that balance between working hard and working too hard? Because I'm sure as you progress through the ranks, that the weight of responsibility must have been quite suffocating at times.
It was, Pete. And I think one of the greatest sort of journeys any leader goes on, particularly when you move from a firefighter to supervisory to middle to strategic, is you learn that span of control, if we were to sort of align it to an incident command situation, it gets bigger. And I think, if I think back to when certainly I became a leading firefighter for the first time back in the early 90s, and then a sub-officer, and then a station officer and station manager. And you suddenly go from thinking about what you're going to be doing next tour on a watch. And then when you become in charge of a district, a station, you start thinking about, what's going to happen that quarter and then that year. And then as you start to progress up to group and area, it suddenly becomes next year's financial planning. And then when you become a strategic leader, brigade manager, you're thinking about the medium-term financial plan in the next 10 years. And I think something that I've seen other people do a lot is wearing being busy as a badge of honour. And I think it's very seductive to think that you can be all things to all people. There's something about solving everybody's problems. There's something about being the go-to person. And I think that feeds a need in the human being to sort of feel valued, but it really is something that really is only feeding your own ego, I think, at the end of the day. And we all have an ego, there's nothing wrong with it. And we all have different kind of ego states and different times of the day, year, whatever, we all have different, that ego state is different. But I think for me, the thing that sort of the big learning thing is that you can't be everywhere, do everything, be all things to all people all of the time. And I think that the big learning thing for me, and it never really disappointed me, was just having that confidence and faith in your team. And you said something earlier there, Pete, around, what happens when I'm not there? And, there is a real pressure, particularly when you get into those strategic roles, that your day job is so busy and you have an awful lot of things spinning, a lot of plates spinning. That's just in the day job before you even throw in a spontaneous operational incident. But also as well, the thing that you remind yourself on a daily basis is that you have some very competent people and some people that would benefit from feeling some of that pressure, for, being exposed to various, and also, trusting people and allowing people the space to make a mistake, because it is that thing around not everybody will do everything the way that you want them to do. Again, it's that thing about just learning that, let's not let perfection be the enemy of the good. And I think we all like to sort of think of ourselves as perfectionists. And it's the question that, whenever I'm interviewing people will say, so what what's your biggest fault? What you're not good at? And people will tend to say, well, I'm a perfectionist, and I've used it myself, and I got called out on it once by my previous boss. He did me a favour, really, because actually, he said, that's a cop-out. And it is, it's like, well, we all, to some degree or another, are sort of perfectionists.
This episode of the podcast is brought to you by Gore-Tex Professional Fabrics. Now, we all know the working environment of a firefighter is filled with challenges. We face serious risks on the job, such as heat exhaustion, burns, physical and mental stress, and we frequently come into contact with high levels of toxic chemicals. Now, I have been wearing Gore-Tex for nearly 2 decades on the front line, working in hostile environments, tackling challenging incidents from firefighting to water incidents and in urban search and rescue environments. Gore-Tex have a well-earned reputation for protecting professionals in the fire and emergency services through their family of highly innovative, waterproof, breathable moisture barriers that exceeds global performance standards and are trusted worldwide. Gore-Tex, going further together. What's the cost of perfectionism?
Blimey. Well, it depends on how far you kind of go with it. I think at one end it could...
Because perfectionism might mean it takes you forever to do something.
Yeah.
And it's also a little bit around, if I give the analogy of operational guidance as an example, it might be a bad example, but we want the outcome. How you get there is up to you. It might not be the way I would do it, but you're probably going to achieve a fairly safe outcome. Nobody died, you resolve the incident, environment, property, life, whatever it might be. Would it have been as quick as I did it? Probably, it would have been absolutely fine. But there's something around that helicoptering in and out and not being... I was doing some stuff around operational guidance recently, trying to get rid of loads of SOPs in the organisation that I work for. And we're adopting a little bit of this. I think it's an NFCC, actually. It's monitor, mentor, manage. Have you heard that one?
Yeah.
Where you look at different levels of how you go about controlling, guiding, coaching, leading or taking control of a situation. I wonder if that's anything of a useful template as I listen to you there to overlay that element of control. Because also when you did get to those higher levels, you would be responsible for, technically in charge of, parts of the organisation that you probably knew very little about at times. When certain people get to places where they're in charge of assets or health and safety or HR, for goodness sake, you are not a qualified HR, whatever. You're not a lawyer, you're not an accountant, you're not a specialist in asset management or any of the health and safety is a key one. We actually hire external people for a reason. So there is a large element of trust required in that, isn't there?
There is, and I think your analogy about the it's almost like a continuum for me. Is that, and over the course of my career, I've been responsible for and had the pleasure of working with some really talented people, from HR specialists, occupational health specialists, training specialists, health and safety specialists, and you do learn as you kind of go. Communications and media, another one. That's just not. I'm a firefighter. I'm not but you do end up, as you progress through, and you're quite right. And I think one of the first things I've always done when I've joined a new team or been responsible for a new team is just look at the individuals, because they are kind of the sum of that team and the strength of that team. And if I use the last few teams that I've worked with, some of those people have been brand new in post and would require, the coaching, mentoring, kind of supportive. And be a little bit more directive around what you need. I think that is your job as a leader sometimes, to sort of direct people while supporting them. And then at the other end of the scale, you may have people that are seasoned veterans, for want of a better word, who have been in that role for a long time, who know the ins and outs of that role and can advise you. And I think it's just about knowing the individuals, knowing and how that sum of that team comes together. And I can think of one role in another fire and rescue service that I worked in where I did pick up the majority of my role was around HR, it was around training, it was around health and safety, it was around occupational health, and all of that sort of well-being, people management side of things, which at the time, you do pick up bits of HR as you go through your career, but it was sort of that director level responsible for that in an organisation. And I have to say, it was great to sort of put my trust and confidence in the team. It was a really mixed team, a mixture of sort of seasoned professionals and new people. But one of the great opportunities that gives you is that you can shape that together and never be too frightened of saying to people, I'm just not particularly comfortable with this. I don't actually understand this. Can you explain this a little more? And you know what? And that gives people permission to do the same. Because I think knowing your limitations...
Also makes them feel valued, I think.
Yeah.
It's a great self-awareness piece where some people feel stupid saying they don't know enough about something. But I think it was... Dr. Brian Cox is always a great example of this. And there's another gentleman, an American astrologer, I forget his name. But they say, if you know something well enough, you should be able to explain it to a child.
Yeah.
So use 10-year-old language and explain to me what that is that you're talking about.
Yeah. And it's right, and I think you've got to rely upon your subject matter experts, but I think also carrying that accountability and ultimate responsibility, does weigh heavily sometimes, depending, particularly when you're dealing with people issues that have a big impact on people. And I think it's about just creating.
Well, everything you do at that level has an impact on a lot of people, doesn't it? The ripples of your decisions can really flow quite far into the organisation, depending on the size of it. But again, it's all relative, dependent on the size.
Yeah, and I think if I use my analogy of starting out from supervisory through to sort of strategic, it's that the big thing that sort of struck me and weighed heavily with me, I took very seriously, was do you want to cast a shine on the organisation, or do you want to cast a shadow on the organisation? And it's often referred to as the shadow you cast, and it gets bigger and bigger as you go through an organisation, and the decisions that you make and the impact that you can have on that organisation becomes massive, and ultimately that ends up in people's lives or experience when they come to work, the services that you provide for the community. And I stopped kind of talking about it as a shadow, casting a large shadow. It's about casting a shine on the organisation. And do you want to cast a shadow? It's not always good news, I have to say. Sometimes, you can't always give people
That's the thing with your stuff at that level, is sometimes you will have to be the bearer of bad news. Because there needs especially I think a lot now when I sympathise with people, given the financial constraints of a lot of just financial constraints and the economic challenges that we have now. There's very few good decisions, or very few easy decisions, that are left. The low-hanging fruit has somewhat been cut already.
Yeah, and sort of leadership and being the best leader you can be has always been incredibly important to me, and I know many other leaders in the fire rescue service take that view, take the leadership responsibilities seriously. But one of the things I used to do, I used to go and spend a bit of time with watches, operational teams, sport teams, but also I used to go and speak to the initial command courses as they were coming through and talk to them about decision making, talk to them about leadership. And one of the questions I would ask them would be to define leadership. And it sounds easy. It's well, what is? Can you just explain leadership to me? And I had some really great responses. But I did what's called the Executive Leadership Programme a few years ago, which was the old Brigade Command course. And I have to say, one of the best programmes I've done in the Fire and Rescue Service, and it equipped me for my role as a strategic leader perfectly.
Remind people what level people do that at, because this is one of my bugbears around, doing it when the horse has bolted sometimes. And I know we are doing a lot more of this mentorship a lot earlier on in people's careers now, but this was something, with the greatest of respect, it felt for me when 20 years ago had a bit of an elitist approach, whereby people would get this as they enter senior leadership, and they could do a lot of damage before they get there.
Yeah, and I think the ELP has worked incredibly hard to kind of try and debunk all of that, to try and stop all of that kind of to use you as elitism through it, and I think turn the spotlight back on you as a leader. But I think, just going back to your question, Pete, I think certainly I would have benefited from that as a middle manager, moving into a strategic role. And I think it's always very difficult in terms of workforce planning to get people at the right time to do that. But I think for me, I did it as
especially now, people are getting promoted so fast.
Yeah, I mean, I did it as an area manager. I think it was about right. Would I have benefited as a group? Definitely. And I know that there has been some consideration.
I think they're doing diluted versions, aren't they? They're doing like leadership apprenticeships. Yeah. I know I've done one, so the crew LF crew commander, watch manager, sub officer roles, they are doing level 3s and 5s. I think
there's apprenticeship standards. There's
similar.
The National Fire Chiefs Council, the NFCC leadership framework, which provides sort of a backdrop. They've got their own development tools. I think the development that's available now is probably the best it's been since, and I'm going to hark back to the promotion exams, I suppose, but maybe we'll touch on that, Pete. But maybe if I could just answer, the question around the sort of the leadership and go back to that one. One of the best definitions of leadership that I heard was on my ELP, and there's two that I love, and I'm going to, if you don't mind, I'm going to share them. So the first one is leadership is about disappointing people at a rate they can absorb. I remember the first time I heard that, and I thought, that's my job. That's what I have to do. And of course, it's not always good news. And I don't know who that's attributed to. I can't give you I'm afraid it wasn't me. Oh, that's all I'll say. And the second one is consistently doing the right thing despite fatigue, personal pressure, jeopardy, and risk to yourself. And I think, depending on what day you ask me, they're my sort of preferred definitions of leadership, because I think people look at leadership generally through a very positive lens. And naturally, I think we should. Leadership is about inspiring people, it's about motivating, it's supporting. But sometimes it's also about putting boundaries in, and also about sometimes you have to say no, and sometimes that you have to give people news that they don't want to hear. And one of the things you quite rightly pointed out, Pete, was just around some of the decisions that fire authorities are grappling with at the moment, particularly in the current financial situation, have been for many years, probably since 2010, is just the reduction in funding for fire and rescue that's been, within the sector over the last 10 years. And I know that I've, in my last couple of roles, have had to really sort of grapple with that, balancing the budget is a legal requirement, and then the provision of those services to meet the needs of the community, whilst also making sure that, we maintain an effective fire and rescue service. It's a real balance and it's a real challenge, and certainly some of the options and considerations that any chief officer team, any principal officer team has to think about will be, unpopular, difficult decisions, and there'll be unpopular, difficult decisions politically within the community and with staff. And I know that, every principal officer team in the country will be balancing, what is right for the community versus what is, what the budget they've got to spend. And of course, fire authorities have to set a balanced budget. They cannot spend more than they've got coming in, and this is an age-old challenge.
Significant legal ramifications to that people don't appreciate. It's not like a company where you can, obviously you forecast, but you can't steal from Peter to pay Paul as easily as perhaps people in the private sector might do at times, and they can take sort of risk analysis gambles on some investments and things that we don't have the liberty to do that.
No, of course, we're dealing with public money, and we need to be accountable and transparent for that. And there are, rightly so, the public expect every public pound to be spent in the most efficient and effective way. And of course, the fire and rescue sector is held to account by His Majesty's Inspectors of Constabulary and Fire and Rescue Services, and they have their own audit and governance arrangements, different governance arrangements across the country. So it's a mixed picture, and some fire and rescue services have traditionally, always had a challenge due to, financial arrangements, governance arrangements, and some have tended to find it reasonably okay. I think that's always been the case across certainly my 31 years service, but you're quite right, it's a really difficult sort of piece to square, really. But we'll always come back to delivering that community risk management plan with the interests of the public at heart, and that is what we have to do. That is what the service sector has to do.
So when you're moving through those levels, there's one of my favourite books actually is a leadership management book. It's Michael Watkins, I think is the author's name. It's called The First 90 Days. Did you ever hear of it?
I've heard of the book.
I'll try and find it and link it in. It effectively talks about breaking down new managers' first 90 days. And I think he's got like 10 separate actions for it. But it acts as like a safeguarding measure to ward against that new job anxiety. Because often the decisions that are made, or like when a leader derails and they quote unquote fail, you can almost always trace it back to the vicious cycles that develop right in the early actions of those jobs. Because when you're preparing for a job, you hear something comes up, you've got a month or so to prepare for it. You're thinking about how am I going to impress? Carl, what would you do to fix training and development? I imagine how many of them conversations are being had across the UK Fire and Rescue Service. Training's really difficult for many different reasons we probably won't go into today. But how do you ward against that? You've seen your successor. You're well aware of the good efforts or bad efforts, management or mismanagement that was done there. You're trying to get a grasp of the team you might be moving into, the roles and responsibilities. How do you stop yourself from knee-jerking in those first 90 days before you get a good... Because it's a balance, isn't it? You can't be sat there for 3 months not appearing to do anything and people go, you're like, well, I might be on a 6-month temporary or whatever. Every job I mean, not that many people get cycled back, but you can be. I'm a big fan of temporary promotions, to be honest with you, because Carl sat in front of me and said all this incredible stuff, and I put him in the role. It's very hard, as you all know far better than me, I'm sure, to it's always easy to say yes to stuff. It's always harder to get out of things and or remove someone or redistribute them in a organisation if they've not achieved the tasking that you hype in the way that you want. So amongst that waffle, how do you ward against that anxiety of, I'm in the team now, I know what I'm going to do, I'm going to smack. I tell you what, you see that thing there, get rid of it. We're not doing that, we're going in the new direction, because what we do struggle with as well is change fatigue. And they always say firefighters hate things the way they are and they hate change. But how do you ward against that anxiety of jumping straight into a new job and not changing everything before you've got a full understanding of what it looks like from the inside?
It's a great question. And I think this is where you've really got to guard against your imposter syndrome here. I know I've certainly experienced it during my career. I think most people do. And I think that is the biggest enemy of the knee-jerking thing. You want to be seen to be delivering results, and you want to be seen to be making those changes and moving on. I think there's a couple of things for me. One is,
do you want to be seen to be doing it, or do you want to be doing it?
Exactly.
Because some people are worried more about how they look than what they're actually achieving.
And there'll always be, so it's the front of house things that you'll want to make sure are right, and we all, our reputation is probably something that we hold very dear as human beings. It's something that we guard
100%.
Fiercely, and of course that's where the imposter syndrome kind of comes from.
In other news, this episode is brought to you in partnership with MSA Safety. Today we have them to thank for the improved firefighter safety through connectivity in their brand new connected firefighter system. At the centre of the connected firefighter platform is the MSA M1 SCBA with telemetry. You can view battery life, air pressure, and estimated time remaining either independently on the M1 itself or from the Luna connected device screen. Also, still with the air status, alarm information, search status, and all of this provided to the incident command for confident decision making during the scene. That integrates straight in with the Luna system, which is a wireless all-in-one device creating an independent search and rescue network, providing edge detection, enhanced personal thermal imaging, while simplifying post-scene reporting and data retention. One of the key parts of the Luna is their FAST system, the Firefighting Assisting Search Technology. This combines directional and distance information with thermal imaging to help find separated teammates and decrease response time. It actually connects you to the other crews in the vicinity for a unified search during the time of mutual aid by instantly notifying the network of Luna devices when there is a downed crew member, allowing for a prompt search and rescue. All of this then plugs into the FireGrid system for cloud-based connectivity, real-time information, and data-driven decisions for the incident commander. It enables you to see the exact location of your firefighters on the scene. And it doesn't require you to be sat on the station. The MSA Hub then provides a wireless gateway straight to the cloud, enabling wireless on-scene data for local and remote incident command for additional eyes on the scene. MSA are truly taking massive strides in the future of improved firefighter safety through connectivity. MSA is dedicated to increasing safety in the fire service through technological advancements. Various feature enhancements, new products, partnerships, and integrations will provide additional capabilities readily accessible by products, software, and services in the brand new MSA Connected Firefighter platform. Now back to the show.
I think how do you guard against it? I think I can only probably speak from personal experience, but I think one of the things that I've always done is just spend a bit of time looking and listening. Just have a look around to see what's what, see the lie of the land, but have an idea about what it is that you want to achieve. Now, for my last job, which was Assistant Chief Fire Officer in the Fire and Rescue Service, I did actually produce a 100-day plan. And I went to the interview with that, and it landed quite well with the authority. I did get the job, funny enough.
Where did you get that from? Not as in you stole it from someone else. I mean, like the idea.
Yeah, it was something.
Was that was that an executive leadership thing?
Yeah, I did a.
And if you're happy to share, we won't share details of the service, of course, but like, what was your mindset?
Yeah, well, it was something that I picked up on the Master of Business Administration MBA course I'd done a few years previously. And it was probably just around that sort of personal effectiveness sort of module that we were doing around just keeping yourself strategically focused. Because naturally when you move from that tactical into those strategic roles, which is what the MBA is kind of there to do, is, you do tend to find yourself focused a little bit more in your comfort zone, the tactical bit, the doing, and it's a little bit easier just to sort of stick your head under the bonnet and tinker around with it, rather than focusing on the bigger picture things, the longer term things that you need to do.
You get back into your comfort zone by doing your old job or telling people how to do the job you used to do, and like it's easy to turn out to jobs. It's not easy, but it's we like doing it. Where firefighters is kind of born in,
and it's called the long-handled screwdriver. And you're quite right. It can happen managerially, and it can happen an instant ground as well. And I've done both. Probably, absolutely, have done both. I think we tend to gravitate back to all the things.
Dan Stevens said he did that too much. He was quite honest about that when he came on. He was like, "I took over jobs I shouldn't have taken over." I said I probably did limit some people's development because I just loved it too much, and that was that. He said that as something he wished he hadn't done so much.
And I've done it myself, Pete. I think I've actively had to sort of make myself very conscious of the fact that if I went onto an incident, at whatever level, if I was taking over, there was a defined reason why. Because that development that you are allowing somebody else to do, it goes back to your point around what do others do when you're not there? You need to, and it's much safer, much more effective to have somebody on your shoulder, kind of saying, "Look, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that?" Just another friendly pair of eyes.
Well, right at that ground level, it's like when you talk to the first incident commanders on the level ones. I always say, and I didn't get it from someone else, is put your gloves in your pockets. You don't need your gloves because you're not going to get, if you start to, it's not saying be lazy and don't help out on the makeup or whatever, but it's like you shouldn't be going in there and taking tools off people at the RTC. That is not your job. Put your gloves in your pockets, leave them there.
It's absolutely right. And you see that at every level. And you've probably experienced it at every level. You've probably experienced it a little bit yourself, Pete. Just around, you do tend to gravitate back to the things that you know. And I think, sort of if I think about my last role as sort of strategic leader, operating at that strategic coordination group, SCG level, taking the sort of multi-agency, complex, high-level kind of decisions, you will find yourself inevitably getting drawn into a conversation with the tactical commander, and you'll probably start making some sort of assumptions around what they're doing.
Yeah. An SCG level, like some people use it as a personal flex. Like they'll ask what's going on, and it's not predominantly perhaps a fire service incident. It might be National Health Service, paramedic, police, whatever. And they are the lead who have declared it a major incident. But we talk about Abbott, and then we go into this long diatribe. I had a retired chief of police at a development management course I was on, led by sim trainer John Lord. Fantastic man. I really like that guy. I'm sure he's imperfect in many ways, but I love him. I think he's very, very good. And we did some SCG and TCC stuff there, and the police officer was very, very good at shutting us up because, like you said, we'd get drawn and bogged down trying to talk to them about ground level tactics because that's your little comfort zone, and in you get and muscle and like. Thank you very much, Carl. That's not for this meeting. That's and you're like, oh, rude. Well, it's got nothing to do with this. No one's interested in how good of a firefighter you are. That's not what you're here for.
And it's a huge distraction from what you're actually there to do. It's like walking into
it's a nice distraction.
Yeah, it's like walking into strategic coordination group. I've seen people walking with radios and other things. And one of the first questions that the chair probably needs to ask is, do you need to have that on, and actually, can you turn it off? Because actually it's a very tactical level thing. It's like having to, not needing your gloves. And in many ways it's kind of symbolic, but it helps people get into that zone of focusing on the bigger things that you really do need to start thinking about now, because it might not have an impact in the next hour, but it might have an impact in 24, 48 or whatever. And I think it's just something that going back to sort of how do you keep yourself focused? I think people do it in different ways, but for me, I've always enjoyed a structured approach to sort of planning defined objectives. So in the first, let's use the first 3 months of joining any team, you're going to need to know, who the people are, who the movers and the shakers are, and the different characters. Everyone's a different character and will have different strengths and areas for development. And you as the leader will...
How do you do that? Sorry, expand on that, because that aspect of building strong relationships and understanding who the cultural architects are in certain teams, I think that can get skipped over a little bit, probably because we come from that command and control background and we put less of a focus on the emotional intelligence.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best things I've always done, and probably colleagues from my last fire and rescue service probably annoyed them to death, is turn up at the end of your desk with a cup of coffee. And I'm really interested. I want to know about you, your family. Not in a sort of intrusive way, but having those kind of water cooler conversations, as they're sometimes called, a discussion over a cup of coffee in the corridor, in the car park, and I think what is always nice is to kind of remember and just to maybe have a little, something about those people, and how my child's in a pantomime, and the next time you speak to them, it's always nice to know how they got on, and I seem to have a bit of a memory for those sorts of things, but genuinely interested in those people, and I think sometimes there's something about that, often referred to as a psychological contract between you and the organisation, and naturally as a sort of strategic leader you do represent the organisation, but you're also a human being. You're also a person that likes to, have positive working relationships with people. And personally, I've always been really interested in other people and really interested in what they're doing. And you can learn an awful lot by just having a chat with people. So doing that a lot's really important. I think seeing how people are in sort of formal environments as well, because there's always that sort of front of house, backstage area where you do need to have those offline conversations sometimes. Because there are different arenas, different environments, but I think for me that informal kind of approach, and using watch visits as an example, I made sure that I got around every watch every year and tried to visit as many of the support teams as I could. But really just getting to know people, and people would open up and start to talk to things. People would catch you in the car park on the way out, and you'd probably learn more about what was going on in the car park. And operational incidents as well, used to put a lot of value on turning up at operational incidents, not in any way, shape or form to take command, but to see how we were performing as a fire and rescue service, but also the conversations at the back of the pump are the best ones you have, and you don't get that sat in your office because the scenery never changes.
Yeah, you spoke about watch visits there and like flexing your leadership style. I have seen from many watch visits from senior leaders, we should all have our own personal approaches to leadership, but when people go, there's a great picture, as one of my favourite analogies for this. There's a caterpillar sat with a butterfly at like a cafe table, and the caterpillar says to the butterfly, "You've changed," and he says, "Yeah, we're supposed to." Do you know what I mean? And I just think that's an interesting aspect of leaders and personal growth, because people think you've swallowed the pill, think it does. And I think the reason they think that sometimes, excuse me, is when you go and do those visits, some people drop into this horrible corporate speak. And I actually think that's part of the success of the podcast, is that I'm not a trained media person. I'm a cluster of a human being with many scars and imperfections, and that's absolutely fine, because secretly we all are, funnily enough. How do you strike that balance between being the professional, representing the organisation in the appropriate way? Everyone at that room will have turned up in a different manner, in a different mood, in a different mindset. How would you carry out things like that as an advice for people that are stepping from that sub-officer or station manager, or area manager, group manager, who are making them next steps up and thinking, right, well, Carl's not my equal anymore, he's my subordinate, and I am going to talk to him as such, and I need to keep the secrets that we had at the tactical group, because that's a thing as well, isn't it? Secrets versus professionalism. How did you navigate? I'm not saying none of us are speaking like perfectionists, like we did it the way everyone should do it, but times you saw it done well, either by yourself or perhaps someone you went with. What did good look like, where you saw a good response from the teams?
I think for me, it's always comes down to intent, and I think if you're going to spend time with a team, group of people, it's about what's your intent with that. What do you want to achieve out of that? And sometimes it's to go and deliver some information, and to give people an update, and obviously try and be as honest as I could. And something that I did see, I worked with a very good deputy chief in a fire and rescue service, who in many ways I sort of wanted to take some of his values and some of his leadership style into the roles after I worked with him. And one of the things that he did was he was always honest, and he always, and if he wanted to dodge a question, he'd tell you, or if he couldn't answer a question, he'd tell you. So he would just say, "Do you know what, Carl, I'm going to dodge that one if that's all right, because we are in discussions with, and it's really a little bit sensitive at the moment. However," so it was kind of that honesty around that they would just come and be as honest as they could. And if it was bad news, if it was, it was not about pleasing the room. I've seen people go and do the visits and they would probably say anything that to get themselves safely out the room and disappear off. And I think that leads to credibility issues with those types of individuals. I have seen people, so I've certainly not wanted to follow that. I think the ones where I've seen the most engagement has been a couple of things. One is that you must be prepared for people to tell you what they need to tell you, how they need to tell you. So don't get prickly about if somebody comes at you with, if they're appearing a little abrasive, a little bit, chewy, a little bit.
They've just missed out on a promotion or whatever. What's going on with Dave?
Yeah.
Why did he not let Sam get overtime at so-and-so station? I've heard it's different. And what's all these local rules for everyone?
Yeah, so park, as a leader, if you're going to go and talk to your teams, park your ego outside. And if people want to tell you something, doesn't matter how it's packaged up, just let them tell you. Now, provided you're not rude, I've said people, I'm not going to be rude to you, don't be rude to me. But generally speaking, I would take that as people have got standards and they care. And most of the time, I'll give you an example. On one fire and rescue service I worked at, I went to do a watch visit, and they really let me have what they needed to tell me, and it did get, it was spicy at times, but that is, being honest both ways is good, professional. And one of the firefighters, had a lot to say, a lot of points to make, and as I'm leaving that evening, and we'd been there for 2.5 hours, and it was a really honest, frank exchange of views. Some I disagreed with, some I agreed with, and we agreed to differ on some stuff, which was absolutely fine. But that firefighter was walking around the drill yard, emptying the bins and picking up the litter. And we had a little chat in the car park, and I just said, look, I can just see that you've got standards and you care. And I remember back to my first watch where I worked with some fantastic firefighters who taught me the benefit of having standards and caring. And I think the advice I would give anybody would be, if you're going up the leadership, just be prepared for people to tell you how they want to tell you, provided they're not rude and abusive. There's no excuse for that. But provided you treat others with respect, and if you ask people for the views, you're going to get them. But just be prepared for how that comes.
And it's knowing your audience, isn't it? Because not thinking people are morons, but we all come from a different background. We all have a different level of education. I always say, and the podcast has been one because I've had some coaching on language and talking and all this sort of stuff. The limits of your language are the limits of your world sometimes. And you might really struggle to articulate that.
Absolutely.
Because people have not had the exposure that you've had and been part of the conversations you've had. So like you said, as long as it is appropriate, then let them use the language that best suits them. And a conversation, it's like a dance, isn't it? The success of this conversation, it's not down to Carl or myself. It's a combined effort of if we don't butt heads and step on each other's toes. And I know I interrupt too much. But that aspect of knowing your audience and allowing them to say it in whatever language. It sounds as almost not offensive, but perhaps a little bit condescending, is like your kids. You know what I mean? They might not understand the language. Just I always say to my kids, just vomit words. Don't worry about how they sound. Let's just piece it together. How can we put some words to your emotions? Help me understand. I always love that, and I always use it in the podcast. Help me understand, because it says I'm not seniority and the God of all knowledge. Come here to distribute it amongst you. Congratulations, I'm here. It's like help me understand that. Even if it's something I think I already know. Whenever I'm talking, all I can hear is the stuff I already know, and I do it too much. It's like I interrupt Carl and interrupt him on a great point of something he's going to enlighten me upon. But how that striking that balance is very, very, very difficult.
And do you know, Pete, I think there's a lot to be said for listening with a genuine curiosity. I think, again, I find myself doing it on busy days sometimes where as somebody is speaking, you're already starting to think about what you're going to say in response. And rather than trying to get a better understanding of that person's perspective, because I think, again, one of the huge learning points for me is the value of perspective as a leader, is understanding people's perspective and valuing that perspective. And when people are giving you, their version of whatever it is, and they want to tell you something, that is their perspective, and it's important to them. And you shouldn't do anything as a leader to devalue that in that individual, because that is important. Now, I'll give you an example. One of the big gripes you always get is, why can't I get my supplies on time? I can't get a Chinograph pencil, the MDTs don't work, the radios aren't very good, I get that. I get that is important, because part of the job of any leadership team is to make the conditions right for people. When at least stuff wants to work, you get your stuff on time, but it's not always perfect and it doesn't always work. But it would be easy for me to say, look, I'm managing a £35 million budget, or was. My biggest worry is whether or not we're going to have to, make changes to fire cover provision, which is going to cut, and all you're interested in is a China. However, that is important, and it's important to pay attention to, because it's all the little things sometimes that make things. Now, I'm not going to pretend, and one of the things I would always say on my station visits is, do not expect me to walk out of this room and fix all of this for you. Because unless there is anything that your, station manager can't fix, or and I can count on.
That's probably closer to your sphere of influence and control than it is to mine.
Absolutely, yeah.
Do you know what I mean? You could probably fix this problem yourself.
And it comes back to the original point, Pete, around it's incredibly seductive to think that you can go and fix all the problems and be everything to everybody. But actually, it might be. One of the first questions I would always ask is, have you raised this? Either through a debrief process, have you raised it through your station manager, your watch manager? And if the answer is no, then I think my advice would have always been, look, first port of call, but then I would say, look, if you find yourself still having a problem in 3 months' time, give me a ring, and we'll have a chat about it, because then you've tried. You've done something to help yourself.
Yeah.
And there is that analogy around, even a broken clock tells the right time twice a day, and people can sort of throw all sorts of things at you, but you've got to pick out the bits that are important. Are you hearing the same thing everywhere you go around X, Y, and Z? And actually, at that point, then it does become an organisational issue. And one of the great values I've always had with engagement with staff is that there are themes that come out, and there are things that come out that when you sat in your...
Doesn't all make it through the filter, does it?
No, absolutely. And when you're making those decisions about provision of training, equipment, whatever, because staff have told me consistently over the last 18 months that this isn't working, you can feed that into the decision-making process. And I think that shows just the value of that senior level engagement with staff, and just paying attention to what is important to them. But just being clear that you're never going to fix it all for them, because actually, have you done anything to help yourself? Or, ultimately it will get to a point where it is a strategic decision, and we will make the decision about allocation of resources. But it's that thing about, for me, I've always taken it as, if people have got a point to make strongly, it's generally because they've got standards and they care. And I think that sort of summarises the fire and rescue service to me. And there are loads of people like that in the fire and rescue service.
I'm going to offer a couple of pivots or builds on what you've said there, because one thing often frustrates me is sometimes when you listen to something and that people don't push back or don't disagree or anything like that. The examples you use there, and I'm sure you'll kick yourself on reflection, is I always try and avoid using closed questions. Like when you say, have you raised this to your manager? Things like, as silly as this sounds, but the clues are always in the language. I always say to people, ask better questions, you get better answers. What have you done to try and solve this problem? Because steering them away from that closed question. But you're so right around the attentiveness of being an active listener. I always think, like in conversations with my wife, a great example is like like you said there, like what's my goal? What's my outcome here? Do I want to be right, especially in marriage? Do I want to be right, or do I want to be happy? Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Am I listening to understand, or am I just listening to respond? Yeah. That is very, very difficult. And also that person's perspective, it comes back to, like you said, when we're talking about going into the role. Oh God, I can't believe Sarah did that before when she was group manager. Stupid, blah. You know what? Likely in the similar situation with a similar resource and a similar perception of options, you probably may likely have made the same decision. I'm sure they had some level of credible logic thread that led them to that decision. And I often think that when you see some people's actions from their own personal blueprint are very difficult to understand. But most of them, you go, if I was in that person's decision in their life circumstances, I may have made a similar decision. And that can be difficult to come to terms with, but I always think it's important to appreciate that, because I very often think, as much as the bullying, harassment and the cultural stuff goes on now, I don't think people gravitate to the fire and rescue service so they can act with malice. There's very few people come into this job or stay in this job with bad intentions. Certainly when it comes to you or them, like, no one gets up in the morning to play one-to-one defense on your goals or ambitions. They largely don't care, not because they're horrible people, but you're just another person in their world. You know, it kind of reflects back to that. If you exploded tomorrow, I'm sure it would carry on.
Yeah.
Ever heard the quote that true leaders are readers? Well, we believe this is true. Listeners often ask where we go to keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening in the sector globally. So there are a few key publications which I encourage you to go check out. Now, if you're looking for insights on disaster management, fire protection and firefighting, for us, we go to Asia Pacific Fire Magazine. And when you're looking for the latest on the Middle East fire protection industry and fire services, it's Gulf Fire Magazine. And our quarterly check-in is with International Firefighter Magazine, reporting to municipal, industrial and fire training professionals. Now, next up, and widely accepted to be the global voice for passive and active fire protection, this is a good one. It's International Fire Protection Magazine. And finally, and perhaps the most relevant to our predominantly UK audience, I'd strongly suggest subscribing to UK Fire Magazine, reporting to the United Kingdom fire protection industry and fire services. We're really excited to announce that after a long-standing relationship and mutual respect, we've now partnered with MDM Publishing, who bring you all of these essential publications. Because in a world of change, the learners shall inherit the earth, while the learned shall find themselves perfectly suited for a world that no longer exists. Eric Hoffer said that, and I believe he was right. So keep growing, keep learning, and keep yourself in the know and at the cutting edge of what's happening globally by dropping into the notes. And as a gift from the podcast, you can actually subscribe to any of these publications for free using the link in our notes. Now back to the show.
One of the things I would take from my time in the sector is just a daily reminder that there is, we have some fantastic people daily who come to work, make a difference, give it everything they've got, with great compassion, humanity, courage, and daily that goes on within fire and rescue service and emergency services. And I think sometimes it's too easy to get. There are times when there is discord within the sector. I know certainly in my career there's been some national disputes that have caused a lot of sort of bad feeling within the sector, and naturally the nature of those things, they do, and it has a cost. And you can also get into, within groups, within teams, within cultures, there is always the groupthink, there is always the stories that emerge. And naturally, I think one of the things I do love about the fire and rescue service is naturally, there's always a good rumour and there's always a good story and there's always, a bit of team think, bit of group think. And I don't think that's a bad thing sometimes. But I think you're right, Pete, when you lose that sense of perspective around why people have made decisions, and I certainly have not experienced people who come to work to, deliberately, work against the aims of the organisation. There's good and bad people in every walk of life, and there's people that. But generally speaking, I just I can count on one hand people that I would probably have thought, wow, I'm not entirely sure. The vast majority of people come to work every single day to make a difference and to do the right thing, and they put their heart and soul into it. Well,
they don't join it for the money, do they? I always say people don't join for the income; they join for the outcome. They want to be part of something that makes a difference. But you said something around, rumours and quote unquote banter in the rumour mill and all that sort of jazz. It is rife amongst the emergency services as a whole. We're actually no different really than the military, and my brother-in-law works as a paramedic, and same everywhere you go. But I remember there was an old Eleanor Roosevelt quote where they said, great minds discuss ideas, average minds discuss events, and small minds discuss people, and try and pin things on people. Or when I fail stuff all the time. I fail so many promotion processes and all this sort of stuff. It always astonishes me the amount of messages I get when I've failed at something or something, and I think how much time, and I appreciate I'm probably a little bit different because I actively make myself more public through the podcast, so I appreciate that, but how much time people spend talking about people, and I'm not sure that's massively productive at times.
It's not, but I suppose if you think about yourself, if you're sitting in a bar, if you're sitting in a shopping mall, sitting in a coffee shop, we're interested in people, aren't we? We're human beings, we're social beings.
I do love people watching.
And we do, don't we? And I do think there's a lot to be said for, certainly on a watch being sort of busy and doing stuff. And I can think of certainly watches I've worked on in the past where we've been reasonably quiet. Gives you a bit of time, to your social time with people, and naturally conversation will naturally fall to, people. And of course, I guess people are probably the most interesting, kind of topic.
They are. I often see people do things and I think, what would I have to believe in order to have done that? Like, what were you thinking there? What mindset would I have had to have been in to have done what you just did? That was, and I think it with my kids sometimes. I'm like, what were you thinking there?
But and you're right, and I think the fire service exists across the piece as social groups. It's both within the sort of enabling services, support services have their own identities and cultures and groups. Watches have their own cultures and identities, and it will happen in every kind of organisation, every military, police. Everybody has their own kind, and sort of that sense of belonging to that social group. And there's always characters in those groups, characters that will be stronger than other characters. Some people will be louder, quieter. We are the kind of sum of our parts. I think the cultures are really interesting things. It's a huge topic of discussion across the sector at the moment, and as long as a culture doesn't have a detrimental effect on people, for whatever reason that is, then culture is just a thing that is there. And again, defining culture, again, something I've had many discussions with teams about over what is a culture. Can you tell me what a culture is? And it's really interesting to hear people's take on what a culture is, and it kind of boils down to kind of the way things are done around here. And there's always an element of fitting in with a culture. There's always an element of sort of in groups and out groups and all that sort of stuff. But that's just human nature. That's human psychology. But I think for me, culture is something. The fire service culture, if we were to look at that as is something to be proud of. And I think there are many positive attributes to the fire service culture, many traditions within the fire and rescue service that we should be proud of, and I don't think we should shy away from that at all. I think where a culture becomes difficult is where it has, if a culture has a detrimental effect on individuals, groups, or the organisation, then it becomes an issue. But I think it comes down to, in many cases, particularly within the fire service, the leadership of that group. The influences within that group, and when I say leadership, I don't mean the defined leaders or the assigned leaders. I think some of the most influential people that I've ever worked with have not held any assigned managerial role at all. They've been, people that have been, just part of the group, but actually are really influential people, for the better or for the worse. But I think it always comes back to human nature being what it is. But for me, leadership plays a huge part in culture within any team, and boundaries as well. There are times when I've seen leaders put boundaries in where they've needed to be put in, and I've taken something from that to think, wow, you've stood up for somebody when they weren't in the room, and I really have a lot of respect for that. But I've also seen leaders that haven't stood up for people when they've been in the room and not been in the room. And again, that sort of has led for my respect for them to evaporate slightly.
Well, it gives an unconscious message that when you're not here, I'll be doing exactly the same to you. People don't think about that sometimes. I've sat there and reflected when I've heard people doing that, and I'm thinking, what are you going to be saying about me when I'm not here? Do you know what I mean? Because you're so willing to just slag Carl off as he just left the room. Do you know what I mean? And I always say that after we reference the senior leadership moments, after they've passed and we're going to crack on with something else for the rest of the evening, people have a variety of things they want to say. And if it's a reflection on the conversation we've had, but sometimes if it's to raise new points in objection, I'm like, no, you had your opportunity to discuss this when Carl was here. That was our opportunity to discuss it. If there's clarifying points we want to have made and stuff like that, but don't start complaining now. You had your opportunity to say these things when the person was in the room. That's always one of my real frustrations. But you mentioned there around culture and teams and It reminds me when I was speaking to Dan Stevens, obviously he was speaking about teams and learning from other teams. It is a big leadership thing. A lot of the leadership books that we look at use analogies from high-performing teams. Obviously Dan spoke a lot about the military and his background there. Are we making a mistake in trying to learn too much from high-performing culture teams? So an example, there's a great book about the All Blacks as one example. I know I've tried to swear significantly less on the podcast now, but one of their punchlines or one of their mottos of the team is no dickheads. We couldn't have that in the Fire and Rescue Service. I don't think anyone would want to write it on their wall. But some really high-performing cultures they have a high demand of each other. They hold each other accountable. Sometimes we would perceive to an unhealthy extent. So when I do see leadership development courses, and I've been on quite a large number of them in this career and in my previous career, and they like to use analogies from sport. In the work that you do now, and in some of the courses that you've been on, do you think it's net positive that we try and take lessons from football teams, sports teams, special forces, people like that? Because it's not inherently what we do. And my thoughts, not yours, is when I look at our recruitment and selection now, we're not really looking sometimes for incredibly high-performing individuals. So it doesn't surprise me that we have an incongruence when they don't manifest themselves into high-performing teams at times. It's very difficult because we're just recruiting from the general public.
It is, and it's great.
I mean, direct entry is a little bit different because we're getting some very high-performing individuals coming in through direct entry. But I hope we're not selling them a false story at times as well. I don't want them coming in. We've had a couple of them on the podcast. Episodes haven't gone out yet, so you won't have heard them. But I don't want them thinking it's something it's not.
Yeah, again, it's a really interesting question just around, I think, if you were to use sort of Formula One team as an example, the marginal gains bit,
Dave Rails.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of where you can put it in a marginal gain. But I think there's also something around having a structural piece that sort of supports all of that. And I think, comparing the agility of, let's say, a Formula One team, a business that doesn't have to justify every pound to the taxpayer, etc. If we were to sort of compare the two, there are undoubtedly some ethics around the team that would probably be beneficial, but the big question I would probably always ask if we're trying to take lessons from other sectors is, have we got the agility and are we equipped?
Yes. We're like turning the Titanic. We can't pivot quick. You read some of those books and they talk about their expectations on change, and people say, I think we can have that done in 2 weeks. And they're like, what? Yeah. I'm talking hours. How many hours is it going to take you to change the entire vehicle or something like that? We're a very big beast and there's a lot of moving pieces.
Public sector procurement, for example, it's there for a reason, but it naturally the process takes time. Governance models take time to approve big expenditure, etc. And I think, the big question I would always ask is, how well equipped are we to sort of lead and implement that level of transformational change as quickly as it would be needed to be done? And the other sort of question I'll probably ask is just how important is speed over quality? Sometimes, yes, you need to do things quickly, and yes, you need to, but also as well, I think there's something about business, sport. They will fail early, and they will go out there and they will, try something, fail early, and move on. And in many ways, that would be seen as a measure of success, that you found out early in the season, early that doesn't work, and that you need to move on. Whereas, naturally within the public sector, if the fire authorities were spending taxpayers' money on a series of failed ventures that led to no tangible outcomes for the community, that would rightly be held up for scrutiny,
very strongly,
because it's public
money,
and a large.
And for us, a big failure might manifest in the death of a firefighter or the death of another member of the emergency services, or a customer, one of the citizens.
Yeah, and it comes back to the purpose of what the Fire and Rescue Service is here to do, and again, sort of remembering what the core values of the Fire and Rescue Service is, and ultimately, the sector is there to serve the public in the best, most efficient way possible, and are held to account either by the National Inspectorate their governance models, the taxpayer, the local, there is an awful lot of scrutiny goes on in terms of how that public money is spent. So I think for me, I read many books like yourself, Pete, around, just how to, those organisational fixes and improvements. And I just very often have the same question: how would that have been implemented within the public sector? And I think it just comes down to the word agility. I don't think the public sector has the agility. And I think if we use COVID as an example, where I think agility was witnessed, and it was the buzzword within the public sector, and certainly I can remember from my own experiences working with a variety of other agencies to very quickly turn around and repurpose. And I think that it was a great success story for the Fire and Rescue Service in many ways, where the Fire and Rescue Service could contribute to the wider national effort because of something that was having a really negative impact on community safety and in many places sadly killing people. And I think that agility, that type, if we could harness that kind of sense of purpose and agility and put it into everyday business. But of course it would require, in many cases, legislative change, changes around rules around how money is spent, so on and so on. Under a national emergency, under civil contingencies, you get a lot of latitude to do what you need to do, and again, sort of led by the NFCC, they did an awful lot of work working with the trade unions to do that. I think for me, yeah, absolutely. If you could harness that kind of, but of course, thankfully, and I hope that we don't experience another pandemic, then hopefully it won't take a pandemic to do that.
Mm. One of the interesting subjects I wanted to discuss with you today, and I know it's something I've heard you speak on very articulately, is, and we term it mental health a lot in our sector. There's a guy we had on, writes a fantastic book, I've got one right next to me, Resiliency Agenda, and he terms it mental fitness, which is a really nice little pivot, not playing silly word games. But one thing I wanted to ask you about was the considerations of, we always do more for others than we tend to do for ourselves, and the mental health of our officers as they move through these different levels. Because I had a couple of meetings, conversations, and had breakfast with trying to be clever with my words, a chief fire officer, unfortunately took his life not too recently. And it must have been right in front of many people. We're not going to, for 1 second, talk about that particular case or even the contributing factors for it. But I don't think we should overlook it or overlook the subject completely around the way in which we look after the mental health, mental fitness of our leaders as they develop. Because I've had a number of close conversations with people, many conversations with people at various levels of leadership, all the way up to the tippy tops in different organisations. But I often think, when the expectation of you is so great, when you have such overwhelming responsibility, you seem to have come out of it. We've only had a couple of conversations, but you've still got all your hair. Some people look like they've had a terminal illness when they've gone through a few promotions, because it just appears, and then maybe other things are going on, I appreciate. But how have you seen that handled well, or perhaps not for yourself, for others? Have you seen any good examples or advice or guidance, or maybe ways of self-awareness that you've managed to navigate those landmines as a leader?
Yeah, and I'd be happy to share personal experience, but if you don't mind, just going back to you where you opened out, and again, we'll mention our colleague that we sadly lost. I would like to just pay tribute to our colleague that we lost, a fine man who is sadly missed and will be sadly missed for a long time.
He stood for a lot more than just his job as well. A very articulate man. I know some people liked and didn't like him, and I'm sure it's the same for me, but really impressive individual.
I knew our colleague reasonably well, did some national work with him, and without doubt, one of his great qualities was wherever you saw him, wherever you met him, you spoke to him, and he made you feel important. And
mate, always remember, I was like, I'm nobody from nowhere, and he remembered a lot of things about me and my personal life, and he listened to the podcast and all this rubbish, and I'm like, what the hell do you remember any of this for? I'm nobody from nowhere.
I've experienced that.
And he took the time to have breakfast with me. Him and his deputy.
I've experienced it myself.
She's a lovely lady as well, actually. Yeah.
I've seen him do it, and I just didn't want to not pay a bit of tribute to his memory. Wonderful man who will be sadly missed. Had a huge influence on the sector and will continue to do so. And I think if you saw social media after the sad news broke, I think anybody will get an idea of how well respected. So, to his memory, just to pause there for a moment, if you don't mind.
Indeed.
But I suppose, mental health. It's something, and again, that I've seen in my career change from being something that just was not talked about, but now I think has really sort of firmly become, and I think it's needed generational change to do so. And certainly during my time, I've seen generations of people coming into the organisation. I've also got a young family myself, who are now young men, and I've seen their approach to mental health is very different to maybe mine would have been back in the day. And I think certainly when I think back to joining the service back in 1992, the approach to building your resilience was to show you pictures of fatal accidents on your trainee course. Now, again, we must not view that too harshly. It was of its time. It was kind of probably what happened to the people that trained me, and so on and so forth. And we look at that now and we think, wow, how does that build any form of sort of mental fitness, mental resilience, but it's that thing about you're never going to sort of plough a field by turning it over in your own mind and just by being exposure to traumatic images.
It's trauma without context, which is not useful for anyone.
And I think there's also something about, and I've learned about this, the vicarious trauma, where you can actually experience something that you weren't there yet by seeing images, hearing recollections of it. You can certainly be affected by that. And I think, that was kind of the start point. That was my entry point in my career, and that was kind of talked about. And it was, well, if you have any problems, then go and see your GP. And I think we all went out into the world and did what we needed to do. And I think there was a defining moment in my personal life, and a couple of changes happened really quickly for me. One was I'd sort of become a dad for the first time. And I was recently promoted to Flexi Station Manager. And Flexi Station Manager, for those that may not know, is somebody you come off a fire engine as part of a team, and you then end up going to incidents in your car, which is, you do a normal sort of 9 to 5 day, and then you'll be on call of the evenings and weekends. But generally quite a busy day job, managing sort of districts and that sort of thing. But I think the change from going from working as part of a team to working on your own was quite significant. And becoming a parent for the first time really, as I later found out, has a profound effect on you and the way that you see the world. And if I can sort of, the first sort of 10, 13, 14 years prior to that, when I was on sort of operations, and yes, you are exposed to trauma. You see some very traumatic things that naturally you expect to see as part of the emergency services. But I can always remember sort of driving away, sort of going back, doing what you do back at the fire station, whatever it is, and there's almost like this informal kind of debriefing process where you will have a discussion, have a chat, and maybe just relive some of this, what you've done, and then you'll maybe talk about it for a few tours afterwards, and
it dissipates it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And also you're able to see different context. Yes. You hear the incident commander's view, the driver who never got off the truck. They all saw this different thing from a different angle, and it will give you more contextual understanding of what happened, why it happened, the things you didn't know. And I think you're making a great point, and I'll stop interrupting you, but I would offer the analogy of, again, my brother-in-law rides an ambulance car by himself because of the level of leadership he's at in paramedic, and he's noticed that as well, even just operating as a team of two versus going out on your own. And I imagine it's not 10 times worse, it's just different for, like you say, station managers. Well, you get home and unload all that on your partner?
Yeah, it's and again, I didn't realise, and this is maybe something around, and you talked about that sort of mental fitness, mental resilience piece. And it's something that is so obvious when you reflect on it, and if you've had the experience of having some challenges, it's so obvious that is such a big transition from operating as part of a team to. And I think one of the things that I've learned over the years as well is whenever there's a traumatic event happens, we all want to be back in the same place where we all were together when that happened. I've noticed that happened a lot, and sadly, I had some events over my career, including sadly, a colleague that took his own life at the station, and I can remember us dealing with that overnight, and then going home in the morning and just sort of going back to lay on the bed and thinking, I'm trying to get to sleep here because I'm going to need to, and then I thought, I've got to be back at the fire. So I went back to the fire station about 10:30, 11 to make a cup of tea and just to be where and one by one, without any prompting, we all came back. and it sort of dawned on me, and I've seen it happen many times afterwards, where teams that are exposed to trauma defuse best together. And not everybody does, and there's not one size fits all. And I know that there's a lot of organisations use the TRIMS, the trauma, sort of defusing, and there's lots of different models out there. And I actually wrote a dissertation on this as part of my MBA around sort of firefighters' preference for psychological support following a traumatic kind of incident. I'll probably finish with that if that's all right. But if I can go back to sort of the personal story, because I think it's something that is important, because it's important to talk about it and it's important to share it. And I think going back to that sort of transition and being a flexi station manager and the patch that I was working at the time in the district I was working was quite a busy patch in terms of road traffic collisions, RTCs. And I think in 1 year I had a significant amount of road deaths, several incidents involving people that had been sadly killed by drink drivers, some involving children. There was a fire fatality in there as well, and I think I counted up about 14 fatalities in a 12-month period. And it just seemed like every time a pager at the time went off and I was going out, so I could be sat at home, at night, 7 o'clock at night, when I was in the middle of, I could be in bed at 3 o'clock in the morning, in the supermarket and a Saturday afternoon, and I'd get mobilised, and literally within 10 to 15 minutes you would be within the scene of to devastation and carnage. And I think what I didn't realise was that over that period of time, alongside becoming a new parent, which brings with it a degree of vulnerability around, my God, I've got a small child, I've got responsibilities, my world is...
You have to open up areas of yourself that you might not have had open for a long time, or never.
Absolutely. And I didn't realise all this sort of transition and adjustment was happening. But I remember a couple of particular occasions. One was where I was on call from home Saturday afternoon. I went to a fatal road accident, sadly, with a young child involved. And I was decorating my youngest son's bedroom at the time. He was just about to arrive. And I remember just walking back into the house and just thinking, and what I realised was, over time, I'd been starting to make some links to my personal circumstances around becoming a parent for the first time, the vulnerability of your children, and the sort of incident that really sort of, made me realise that I couldn't really go on experiencing that level of trauma was sadly when a colleague took his own life at the fire station. And I can remember going to the station with the crew, and we worked on him, tried to keep him alive. And sadly, I brought the news to his family, and I remember just standing there seeing the impact that had on them. And again, going home that day, that night, that morning, and I remember just thinking, my way of thinking has now completely and utterly changed about how I see the world, and I'm expecting now bad things to happen. And that I was transferring that sort of vulnerability onto my own family, thinking, every time my young son went out in the car, would it? And I think at that point, I suddenly realised that I needed some support and assistance to sort of come to terms with the level of trauma that I'd been exposed to. And the hardest part, and I'll never forget this, and this is the thing that spurs me on to talk about accessing mental health support, is that the service I worked in at the time had an employee assistance programme. and it was a free phone help number that you could ring up for these people. And I can remember that day about lunchtime, sat on my bed with the phone in my hand, with the card in my hand, and I'm saying to myself, why are you fearful of doing this? And there was loads of things going through my head, thinking, am I going mad? Am I ever going to be able to go? Are they going to take me off the run? I'm never going to be able to go back on the run again. Is it going to ruin my career? Am I going? All of these things start to go through your head, which, as I did my research later on for the MBA and the dissertation, which I subsequently used to inform the support services that we provided, that it's not uncommon, and I think the thing that I want to talk about with, and I've always talked about with crews, is that everybody should be comfortable without any fear or stigma attached to it of actually putting your hand up and saying, I'm struggling, I need some help. Because the upshot is that if you can get in early at the point at which you realise, ideally before, but none of us ever do sort of realise, it's like the frog in the pan of boiling water. It can take incremental temperature raises, but if you put it in a pan of boiling hot water, it'll jump out. It's that whole thing around, as it incrementally gets hotter, you don't necessarily know it, and of course, if your state of mind is being impacted by what you're seeing, but I'll never forget the difficulty and the questions I was asking myself around, why am I fearful of accessing support? And it turns out I didn't need to be. Because the support then that wrapped around me, and I wasn't broken. I was, in the traditional sense, I couldn't not function, but I just knew that my whole perception of life had changed, and that the way that I started to experience some of the physical symptoms of it, fear and anxiety around, if I go to another job, and my next job, because pretty much every time I was going out the door, there was sadly somebody losing their life. But that was just being confirmed to me every single time. And I think just making those links to families, friends, colleagues.
If you're a regular listener to the podcast, then chances are you are big into your own personal development and the development of firefighters around you. So I wanted to remind you of our mobile app Drill Book. This is a free training and development resources made by firefighters for firefighters. Heading on to Drill Book, you will find incident debriefs, radio messages, knots and lines, quick reference guides, quizzes every single day. We've got useful links to the ERG, to Web Rescue, to Jessup, Euro Rescue, 10-second triage, National Operational Guidance. You've got trauma skills sessions and questions in there with 10-second surveys, patient handovers, questioning, bleed controls, vitals, major incidents, and not to mention our daily quizzes where you will find questions on extrication, casualty handling, breathing apparatus, fire development, water rescue, rope rescue, you name it. It is the go-to resource if you've got a spare 5 minutes on the firehouse to develop yourself and those around you. Not only that, if you're looking to get into the fire service, we've got advice on there on interview questions, interview answers. You can build your own questioning in there. We've got radio messages apps where you can develop and put together your own methane, IFCO, and a whole area dedicated to knots and lines and incident debriefs as well. All of the incident debriefs that we have gone through on the podcast, you'll find them there. And again, remember, this is built by firefighters for firefighters. So you can add your own drills in there. You can pick the drills that you find the most favorite. When you go to search for different drills in there, you can find breathing apparatus, hazmat, incident command, ladder drills, pumping, RTC, trauma skills, winching and recovery, urban search and rescue, height rescue, water rescue. There is literally hundreds of training ideas, hundreds of drills in there, and you can continue to build this library of resource for yourself and for firefighters all around the world. Remember, this app is absolutely free and it grows every single day down to the contributions of our thousands and thousands of users. So if you've got that favorite training drill and you want to share it with somebody else, get in there. If you're looking for ideas for training yourself and your crews, get in there. It's freely available on Android, Apple, and you will find it in the links for this podcast. Remember, it's called personal development. The clue's in the name. You've got to work twice as hard on yourself as you do on the job. So always be growing, always be developing. Now let's get back to the show. Well, that's what I mean, because at that role, you don't go to nothing jobs anymore. Do you know what I mean? You go into 4 pumps plus every time, or a complex hazmat or something like that. But it is so right. We did an episode a couple of years ago, actually, with the Firefighters Charity around making the first call. And like you've just perfectly articulated, all those massive challenges that people build around the what ifs. But I also think of it like hydration. You know, if by the time you feel thirsty, it's a bit too late. Not too late, but you're probably well into the dehydration already. You should have already sought that level of support. What do you think around the aspect of when we join the services? we have physical testing. We have most services across the UK, certainly across the UK, have annual fitness tests. I think they all have annual fitness tests, but we don't seem to have had the same approach yet with our mental well-being. And I always think, like, I'm a watch commander. If you have to replace me, because I go off with... So stress, I think, overtook musculoskeletal injuries as the biggest lost time work reported in maybe 2 or 3 years ago. Stress and mental health, mental well-being, collectively, are the ones that people are going off for and costing the services a lot of money, which is not the framework in which to look at it. But ultimately, when I go off, you've got to pay someone else 40 grand to come and do my job because I'm not there doing my job. And I just think, how many are off all the time wrestling with these things? And are we putting enough preventative measures in place? If on day one, week one, or even annually, the cost of, 55, 60 grand to get a mental health professional, an actual mental health professional, not someone like me that's just done a mental health first aid and trim qualification. I'm only slightly better at some things because I'm a recovered addict, and I've actually accessed a lot of counselling, a lot of support. I've had sponsors and mentors, and because I've messed it all up and narrowly got through the gap of surviving sticking needles in myself for too long, I don't think, not everyone would make it through that gap. And I've not made it through it. I've got a lot of scars and I've not made it through it in one piece by any stretch of the imagination. But do you think there would be an appetite? And I'm sure probably some services are already doing it. Big services, London and people like that have probably already got these larger teams in place. And some of it might be a factor of scale and affordability. But I just think if Carl knew, if I've got an issue with my back, I go, well, I'm going to see Sam, James, Sarah, whoever my physical occupational health person is. I'm going to see them every year for my annual fitness test. I'll bring it up then. And that would remove the barrier of pressing the big red help button. And I wonder if I'll see it. I'd like to think I would if I stay for another 15, 20 years, whatever I've got left. Do you think there would be a big enough appetite for that? And I appreciate these things are expensive, but again, you'd pay for itself in a year, I think.
Yeah, and it's really great. And I think to draw the sort of comparisons between the musculoskeletal and the mental health is really, really helpful. And if I can just take us back to things 30, 35, 40 years ago. I was out, how long ago? 10 years ago, just out, and there was a few old firefighters that I know, they were out as well, and we were having a chat in the pub. And one of the guys, great respect, for I had to leave the job early due to musculoskeletal back injury, came over, and at the time I was championing quite a bit of mental health work within the service that I was in. And he sort of said, look, really positive to see, it wasn't, he said, I'm going to tell you something now. I left officially because of a bad back. And he said, it wasn't a bad back. He said, and he'd had a similar experience to me in that, the support that was available was not available, and the stigma attached with raising a concern or putting your hand up was just too much in that individual. And he said, I wasn't on my own. And I do wonder how many people, and certainly when I've been looking at organisational statistics around sickness and seeing mental health creeping up, it's almost a leading indicator in many ways, because I view that as a positive in as much as people are now coming up and openly saying, I am not coming to work because I'm suffering with poor mental health, as opposed to saying I've got a bad back. And I think in many ways, once you know what the problem is, you can start to try and fix it. I think from a strategic point of view, to get investment in, let's say, physio versus therapy, and if you were making funding decisions around the provision of a physio for musculoskeletal and therapy for mental health, if your statistics told you that you had 40% of your sickness attributed to musculoskeletal and 5% mental health, you would struggle to justify spending a lot of money on therapy. However, this is where I think, and it comes back to the sort of society and the cultural piece being a positive, in that people feel safer, and it comes down to psychological safety in an organisation can have many benefits. But psychological safety, in many ways, is just how comfortable are you to put your hand up and say, I'm struggling, or you want to complain about something. And if you've got a high level of psychological safety within the organisation, and this links back to the cultural piece, people will be more honest and open to tell you. And actually, coming back to where you put your money, and would you put your money, let's use house fires versus RTCs. If your stats were telling you that 60% of your fatalities were in a house fire and 40 were in RTCs, you would proportionately put your money there. So I think the more people are open, and the more people, and I appreciate it's very hard, very difficult, and it depends on the culture within your team, organisation, and also yourself. We all have a different approach. We all have different preferences for support, and therapy might not be for people. Having access to a counsellor may be preventative. It may be, it may be something that you can access just at the point you realise it, or when you've gone past that point. But again, going back to some of the research around firefighters' preferences, the number one kind of support mechanism is the team, and many people kind of sort of said, certainly during the course of the research project that I did, was just around the team is their preferred port of call, and then it's family, friends, therapy, and then it sort of goes down. And guess who's at the bottom? Guess who would be the last person you would tell that you're struggling? And it's your line manager. And of course there is a lot. You can understand that, and I don't think that's any reflection on the leadership of the fire and rescue service. I think it's just people. And I've been there, so I'm talking from I can only talk from my own experience. I'm not making a judgment on anybody else here. The last person I would have gone to say, look, I'm just struggling with this a little bit, would have been my line manager. The first port of call would have been the team. But when you become into that station manager, your team dynamic changes slightly, and your team isn't all of a sudden the watch where you can go back to the station, go back to the place, diffuse over time. It's different, but I think it's worth recognising that. So maybe just to answer your question, I think there is also something about recruitment and selection of staff, getting I will say the right people, the most appropriate people for the job, and it's incredibly difficult to test somebody's psychological kind of profile without going into in-depth discussions with psychologists. There's many services use psychological testing to a greater or lesser degree, but our point of entry selection tests are based predominantly around physical ability tests. Fit, fast and strong, and again, I'm not making a judgment on that, because it serves the sector well because of the demands of the role. And there's been much research has gone on through Firefit, through the NFCC, the National Point of Entry Selection. It's a very, very difficult one to kind of get absolutely perfect. But of course, maybe there is something to consider within there around the profiling of who we employ for these roles. And again, we maybe need to look to other sectors around the police, the ambulance, the military. But again, have they got it right? I don't know the answer to that. But it's about, for me, if you get people with the right characteristics, personality characteristics, they understand. Nobody can prepare you for this. Nobody can prepare you for that first fatality or sustained exposure to trauma. But it's about then it kicks into your organisational culture, your ability to sort of access help, awareness, the self-awareness of when you are experiencing the symptoms and signs of suffering, the adverse effects of exposure to trauma, and I think that's possibly where, and I know many services do. I know many services have those facilities available, and the Firefighters Charity as well have those sort of facilities and those awareness sessions. So I think it's growing, and will we see it? I hope we will. I certainly hope we get to a point where sort of mental health is as acceptable to talk about as physical health, if not more so.
Today's podcast is powered by our partner Lifelines and their revolutionary approach to functional hydration. Just like in firefighting, water is essential for body function, but studies show more than 80% of firefighters are dehydrated. A 25-year study findings from the National Institute of Health showed poor hydration to be linked to early aging and chronic disease, and even mild dehydration results in significant negative impact outcomes including headaches, exhaustion, rapid pulse, irritability, and poor cognitive function. A study conducted by Yale University showed that participants who were just 1% dehydrated had a 12% increase in errors when performing tasks that required cognitive flexibility. In addition, dehydration is shown to worsen mood and attitude, contribute to confusion and poor decision making, and negatively affect memory and judgment. In other words, you really don't want your incident commander, firefighter, or for that matter any first responder on a critical scene to be even slightly dehydrated. Mild dehydration occurs when a person is just 1.5% dehydrated, a condition that does not even trigger the thirst response in most people. So just imagine how quickly a firefighter or any first responder can and does become dehydrated in their day-to-day duties, which is why I address my hydration first thing every day with Lifelines. Go into the notes for this episode and specifically check out Lifeline's Hydro Fuel and Hydro OG by clicking in the notes for the podcast for a clean energy solution designed for those who demand more from their day. Now back to the show.
You spoke there around psychological safety. And I think this has a role to play if we change gears into the decision making. And we've spoken at great lengths, well, in different, again, varied opinions around this aspect of operational discretion, which merges its head more often than we'd probably like. Catherine Lamb has some wonderful analogies for it when she's been on the podcast. But you attended an incident in the mid-90s, which I'd love to zoom in for a second, because it's something that's perhaps one of the worst scenarios I can think of for incident commanders to attend. It was around two teenagers trapped underwater in a car. Obviously, water and our ability to enter it and the different modules and restrictions and guidance around it is a very sticky subject for people these days. But I'd love for you to expand upon this conversation of decision-making, operational discretion, perhaps under the framework of reflecting, if appropriate, on the incident you attended back then, because things were very different.
Yeah, and I think maybe if we start with the kind of operational discretion as it is now, and I think it's important and really encouraged to see the guidance on, and I was a big sort of advocate of discussing this with commanders in service to make sure that they knew that when they took a decision that they would be backed, and if they had to step outside of procedure protocol, then they would be supported. There is always a risk that things will go wrong, and I think focusing on making sure that commanders know the rules before they can bend the rules is an important thing, and then stepping back inside where you can. But the thing that particular incident taught me beyond doubt was a reminder that I took through my career that initial commanders are faced with some very challenging, time-critical decisions that certainly, as I then became a flexi officer and then sort of on through my career, it was something I never forgot. I would always remember pitching up at a job many times, and it was very different to how it had been described or how the messages were coming through, but also remembering that 20, 30, 40 minutes prior to that, the initial incident commander was faced with a very, very difficult decision.
So paint that picture for us of the context before we go into it so people can get an understanding.
Yes. So this incident was documented in the press, so there's no confidentiality issues here, but it was 1998, I think it was, a very different time back in the service that I worked in, and I remember I was on station at the time, and the bells went in. We just got back from another job. I think it was about 1 a.m. and so we were up and about, and it was a car in the water at a local beauty spot, and this car had entered the water. One person had escaped and raised the alarm, and we were pretty much out the doors within, pretty much before the bells had finished, and we were on our way. And the information that we were getting back was that the car had only just gone in the water. It was February, very cold, and of course you're already thinking about chances of survival, etc. And of course you hope that it's going to be different when you get there. How many times do you turn up and it's something slightly different? But we pulled up there and the police had just arrived. And I remember sort of running down to the riverbank with my colleague, and I think we're going to set the scene. This was before the days of national operational guidance. It was before the days of fire service doing water rescue. We didn't even have life jackets on the pump. We had, the only thing we were equipped with for a water rescue was a general purpose line and a ceiling hook, and that was it. So I'm going to sort of, some people may sort of just to set the scene there, that was all we had. And I remember sort of running down to the riverbank and seeing the car under the water. It was about 10 foot under the water. I could see the lights run, and there was a young man there sort of screaming out as that his friends were trapped in the vehicle. And what had been happening is he'd been sort of riding around on the roof of the car, reportedly, and then they'd gone into the water. And literally, this must have happened within about 4 or 5 minutes of us arriving. So naturally, the question that comes through your mind is, are those young men alive? Are they breathing their last? And I remember the police officer turning to me and saying, can you do anything? And it was myself and another firefighter who was actually an open water swimmer. He was an open water triathlete, actually, was this guy. Really fit, really competent in the water. And just if I can rewind back about 6 months prior to that, and again, another well-documented incident at the time was there'd been a vehicle enter a quarry underwater with a child in the back. And one of the firefighters had gone in with the breathing apparatus set on, carrying a big rock, and had walked down this sort of shelf to the child, rescued the child from the car, who had made a recovery but sadly subsequently died. And that was kind of the narrative around at the time was, wow, that's happened. That was so without really saying too much to each other, we just went back up to the pump, got 2 BA sets, took our fire kit off, and we attached a line to ourselves, started our breathing apparatus sets up, and we entered the water. There had been some previous tragedies involving, I think it was a sub-officer in Merseyside or Manchester, where somebody sadly lost their life within the last 12 months. We were quite aware of the risk, but the pressure we felt, and sometimes you've got to put yourself in harm's way to do something, and the thought of those young men being under there spurred us on. I've got to say, it was a reasonably fast-flowing river. We tried everything. Long story short, we made several attempts to try and get down to the vehicle. At one point, I had my hand on the door handle, but just due to the water pressure, the cold, our face masks were filling up with water. And I've got to say, without being too dramatic, I think it's the closest I've ever come to being in serious danger in the job. Been in many fires, been in many other situations, and all that sort of stuff. But just that one, I just know that when we came up for the last time,
it's having that line attached as well, isn't it? I've seen video footage of police officers with lines attached, and then something else coming down the river and trapping you and dragging you.
Horrendous, really. And when I think about some of the things that we did, I was there with the other crew. There was another crew arriving. We'd pitched a ladder. We'd done all sorts of stuff to try and just. But sadly, we spent 10 or 15 minutes in the water trying to get these 2 young men out, and sadly, we just couldn't do it. And I know that we came up for the last time, and I looked across, and my colleague was having the same thoughts just around, right, I think we need to get out the water now. And actually, we couldn't physically get out the water to be carried out, and sort of early onset hypothermia. And I remember sort of sat in an ambulance afterwards with my colleague, and we sat there with the space blankets on, shivering, and just a real sense of absolute disappointment that we just couldn't do what we needed to, despite putting ourselves in harm's way. We did, and we did everything, absolutely. And I certainly later watched a documentary on the Grenfell tragedy, and just listening to the accounts of and it is in no way comparable, I will have to say, but just listening to some of the accounts of the firefighters that tried really hard to get to those people, and there was one firefighter, and he got a little bit emotional towards the end, and he said, we tried really hard, and we just couldn't, and I felt myself feeling that emotion again, and I understand that, and I think that's how deep it runs for the emergency services that and particularly the fire and rescue services, that we will do things sometimes that bend the rules. Now that there's bending the rules and there's bending the rules, and I did actually use this as a discussion point with initial commanders when I went to speak to them on the command courses to talk about operational discretion. I'd always give it a health warning and say, by the way, don't ever do this. Do not. This is so far now. And nowadays, some of the organisational learning that came out of those incidents was that breathing apparatus is not to be used underwater. That is a red line. And that doesn't fall into operation. That is negligence. Let's be honest, that's a reckless violation. And I've done it, and I'm not proud of it. But it was a different time. It was different circumstances. And the difficulty, and so again, some of the organisational learning that came out of it after the child was rescued from the vehicle successfully previously, the organisation had an opportunity then to sort of say, look, well done, however, but it was kind of the unsaid thing that if you went to a water incident, we just knew that there was very little we could do, just best endeavours. But what is the positive that sort of comes out of that, certainly for me, and sharing that story around just there is dangerous decisions and there is dangerous decisions. But there is also a point at which sometimes we will have to, or firefighters will have to put themselves in harm's way where life is at great risk and there is a chance of survival. And those time-critical decisions aren't perfect by any stretch of the imagination. The conditions aren't perfect. You are up against it. And it's easy to judge people on hindsight. And it's dead easy when you're an expert after the event. And again, it's that old Roosevelt thing around the man in the arena. It's about, the credit belongs. It's not the critic that counts. It's the person that's in the arena that's having to make the decisions, that's doing what they need to do. And I think that taught me a really important lesson, both as a firefighter, leading firefighter levels at the time, all the way through to brigade manager, around just remembering that the pressure that initial commanders feel and being compelled to act, but there is also a tolerance for risk, and it's about getting that balance right. So I use that for the avoidance of any doubt. I use that as a what not to do. I'm not going to say that was a good idea,
but I think people are still clutching at straws for solutions because of limited funding and the competency and maintenance competence that's required for things like swiftwater rescue. I feel most for our on-call stations in some of these low densely populated areas, but they're usually low densely populated because they're naturally quite beautiful. There's more expensive houses and beauty spots aplenty, but because the domestic or business risk isn't large there, it's the Plonkin on-call station there, and a lot of these don't have the capability. So whilst it was a different time, people do still find themselves in similar circumstance.
They do, and I can think of several stations, not a million.
There was one last year I remember reading about. I think they used a 9-metre lad. I remember the lad messaging me about it. He reached out to the podcast, but the senior leadership didn't let him come on the podcast. But they successfully carried out a rescue, and again, which goes against pure regs and all this sort of stuff, laterally loading a ladder and using it as a bridge to get these people out of this fast-flowing water on a vehicle. But the point I'm making is these things still happen.
They do, and think of where I'm sat now. Not too many miles away from me, there are stations, particularly on-call stations, that have a high degree of water risk, and that some of that risk is, I've known them have to turn up and rescue people from cars that are in fast-flowing floodwater, and some of their decisions they've taken have been life critical, and I'm convinced that had they not taken those decisions, likewise, it is a really difficult sort of thing for the fire and rescue service. The procedures are very clear, and they're there for a reason, and they're based on hard experience. But of course, the fire and rescue service is not equipped for subsurface rescue. Going into, again, it comes down to perhaps the purpose of the fire and rescue service. Yes, it's a reasonably foreseeable risk, but again, it's something that every chief officer grapples with, is around just making sure that your resources to your risk. Thankfully, it's an infrequent occurrence. However, when it does happen, it has a big impact, and it can have an impact on the crews who are compelled to act, and maybe sometimes, particularly with subsurface rescues, feel quite helpless. I've been there, I understand that myself.
I think there's a difference between, from my research and speaking with individuals of different organisations, part of the Jessup principles is the NHS and paramedics have a different metric of survivability in terms of time in the water and things like that, whereas we immediately go to subsurface is not our provision. Police technically are equipped to deal with it, but their resources are fewer and much further stretched than ours. So it is still, I think it feels like we have done many risk assessments for it, and we've invested in upskilling many of our staff, but I'm still not comfortable with it personally. I don't think we're where we need to be with it, and I know there's hundreds, probably thousands of people ongoing in different organisations trying to future solve this problem, but don't think we're there yet.
The best solution I've seen to this, I did some training back in 2000. I spent a few weeks with the Swedish Fire and Rescue Service, and I think it was Stockholm Fire Station has its own diving unit. As you know, Sweden, they have a lot of water risk and a lot of it.
We had one of them on the podcast.
Well, again, it was a fantastic, when we got to know and they took us around the fire station, they have a diving unit. And a helicopter that lands on the roof that takes the divers to the scene, and then the land unit makes its way there. And again, we're not there.
And I don't know if we have an appetite to help. Of course we do, but it's just whose bucket does it sit in, and we're very underfunded. I think we're just like the slightly financially abused cousin of the emergency services sometimes. And I appreciate this because the police and the paramedics are bigger and they do a lot more sometimes, sort of. But I always say, you know exactly what you call an ambulance for. You know what you call the police officers for. Everything else, largely, kind of rolls down to the bottom of the hill, and we end up dealing with it. We turn up with a big red toolbox and have to mackle together. We're like the eternal problem solvers,
It's what makes the Fire and Rescue Service what it is. It's what makes it great. And whilst that there's a fine line between that being kind of an expectation and I won't use the word abuse, but if you know, it's that whole thing around it comes back to the purpose of the Fire and Rescue Service. I think, you know, we go back to the first ever State of Fire report by Sir Tom Windsor, and one of those recommendations that is still outstanding is around defining the purpose of the Fire and Rescue Service. And I think that will be massively helpful for you know, fire and rescue authorities, chief officers across the country to just get some clarity. You know, it's laid out in statute. You know, chief officers and authorities know what their statutory duties are. There is also an expectation, again, probably as you say, that we will attend and we will deal with. And of course, you know, the Fire and Rescue Service is fantastic at doing that, and it always will. And firefighters and the crews will turn up and do whatever they need to do within their sort of, you know, capabilities. And there is always a thing about being able to do more, I think. But of course, that brings with it challenges around funding, roles, responsibilities, all of which probably needs to be squared at the national level.
You have done a great deal of work with national frameworks as well, though. One of the things that we had in our notes, which I'd love to discuss, because we kind of go from one end of the spectrum to the other here. You've had a low-resourced, boots on the ground, literally in the water experience yourself, and then I remember you referencing a significantly larger scale response to a flooding incident that you had in 2015 on a whole nother scale, and I know you drew a lot of lessons from that, which I wonder if we have time to go into.
Yeah, and I think if ever you go through your career thinking, when's my big one? When's the big one? I think for me that was it. A terrifying experience in many ways at the time, but I think what it taught me was immense, and I think some of the learning that came out of it for the sector and for the organisation was really beneficial. And I think again, just the thing about the team and trusting your team, that for me was just a defining moment where I remember sat looking at the people I had in the room thinking, I wouldn't want anybody else here with me other than you people, because this is what's going to get us through the next 24, 48 hours. So I suppose just to set the scene, it was 2015 and there'd been a number of storms declared back to back. I know that Cumbria had been underwater in the north of England, and the weather system as it was sort of coming down the way. And it was City of York, again, well documented. There was a technical issue with one of the barriers that sort of prevents water from going into. And now, for those that don't know, York is a medieval city with huge national heritage importance. Also has a large population.
It's beautiful, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lovely city, but very prone to flooding. But this barrier that was put in was designed to sort of stop the confluence from one river to another. It'd been a very, very busy sort of weekend. It was my sort of duty week on, and I can remember we had a tactical coordination group, TCG, which is where all the agencies get together to discuss the latest issues. And we'd had some issues, some around the city of York, some around various other places, but nothing that we couldn't handle. We had a very, very busy sort of 24 hours, and it was Boxing Day evening. I remember it well. And on this teleconference, I'd just got home after quite a busy 24 hours, thinking, right, I'm going to get something to eat and hopefully get a night in bed. And I remember the representative from the Environment Agency at the time discussing the issues with the barrier. Basically, the barrier had failed, and again, well documented that was then causing flooding in the city centre of York. Now, city centre of York, thousands and thousands of residents, huge heritage risk. And at that point, kind of as things would normally, fire and rescue service have the water rescue capability. And it was just a very, very brief discussion around what is our capability, what can we bring in order to start the evacuation. And again, the flood maps were put up. It was quite clear that we had at immediate risk over the next sort of 6 to 12 hours, there were hundreds and hundreds of properties at risk. And I can remember sat there thinking, right, wow, this is the big one. This is going to take some resources, given that we'd had 24 hours of pretty much back-to-back flooding. And I remember picking the phone up to one of my colleagues and saying, right, we're going to have to push the button here for some national resources. And again, for listeners that don't know, the Fire and Rescue Service has what's called a National Coordination Advisory Framework, NCAF as it's known, which is basically the ability for a fire and rescue service to draw resources from all over the country, specialist resources such as water rescue or urban search and rescue or high volume pumps, and took the decision to establish what's called a strategic holding area where we would start to bring some of these resources to. And I put in an initial call for about 10 powerboat teams, 4 or 5 different high volume pumps, some tactical advisors to come down and start giving me some advice on what we were going to do. And I'm also thinking, well, all of the crews have been out, all of the officers have been out. It was Boxing Day evening, 7 p.m. And I know I'd be doing a Boxing Day evening at 7 p.m. I'd definitely have a beer open. I'm thinking, right, I'm going to need to get some people back to duty here, and we're going to need to start pushing the button. And I remember getting to the fire station on the outskirts of York, where we had put the initial strategic holding area in. I put a couple of phone calls in on the way there to try and get a couple of people, and thankfully, 2 very, very capable officers who I joined with, knew very, very well, good friends, were able to come back to duty, and we started assembling the team. And I can remember just sat in the office.
Did you not get a phone call from a more senior leader at any point to go, Carl, what do you think you're doing?
Well,
I'm getting calls that you've asked for every man and his dog and helicopters and boats.
I did quickly brief upwards, but I think the direction was absolutely fine, crack on. So it was left over to sort of me and the team to sort that one out. So we got there, and I can remember sat in the office at the fire station, looking at the desk phone, the IP phone, like an internet phone, and all of a sudden the lights dimmed and flickered, and then the phones went off, and then the mobile phones went off, and of course the water was rising and affecting all the substations. It was like a really bad incident command assessment. I'm thinking this. I was looking around for the cameras at one point, thinking is somebody tested me here? But I suppose. That was a week-long incident, and we ended up scaling it up to 20 powerboat teams from across the country. We had teams from Cornwall, London. We had 5 high-volume pumps designed to shift thousands and thousands of litres of water, protecting infrastructure. I had a team of 10 national advisors down. We had a Chinook helicopter, and at the time, the strategic coordination group was briefing up into COBRA, so the government's emergency sort of briefing arrangements, with David Cameron was the Prime Minister at the time. And I can remember sort of...
Do you know what COBRA is?
Say again, sorry?
People always think COBRA sounds like a lair
It does,
somewhere.
yeah, it does. I've actually been in the room, and it's very underwhelming, but it's...
It's just Cabinet Office Briefing Room A, isn't it? That's all COBRA stands for.
I think it's A&B.
It's one of those acronyms. It's a good one. I like it.
I think they should keep it.
It wouldn't have worked if it were Room B, would it?
Something else. Yeah. But yeah, so I think, to cut a long story short, I think that for me, we ended up for a week sort of running a very, very complex operation with crews from all over the country on rotation. And I have to say, the team, and this comes back to having trust in your team. There was a time when I was driving to that strategic holding area on the first night, and I was on the phone to control. I had the National Tactical Advisors ringing. It was about an hour to get to this fire station. And if my phone wasn't ringing, it was like I was on another call. And I was just remember thinking, this is completely and utterly has the potential to overwhelm. But I think it's that thing it comes back to when you start seeing the people around you and thinking, that span of control and trusting people and giving people a job and getting them, having trust in people to do what they need to do, because people will always. And I think for me, New Year's Day, I went to close the strategic holding area because it had sort of gone on that long. And I remember sort of going home, and my first immediate reflection was, wow, the team worked. The arrangements, the national arrangements, the local arrangements, the team, the people, the training. And if ever there was a time, and I do sort of look back on it with some sort of pride in what the team managed to achieve. And thankfully, nobody lost their life. There was no injuries. Sadly, lots and lots of people's homes were damaged. However, the recovery operation went in, and I have to say that due to and I attribute that to the work of the teams, the coordination, and I think it's what makes the UK Fire and Rescue Service great. I think having pressed the button and had everybody from sort of the Prime Minister at the time, I'm not name dropping at all, sort of basically sending you resources and saying, look, don't worry about the cost of the Chinook at £65,000 an hour. Don't worry about this. We're going to send you some troops. And literally UK PLC just wrapped around that incident. And again, so to show, it's sometimes people don't see all of that. And when you press the button, when you need that support, when you need that help, it was there. And the arrangements worked. And I think since then they've just got better and better and better as they've been exercised.
The National Resilience Team is very
really
impressive.
Good.
I've done a lot of work with them through USAR and ISAR and stuff like that. And I think they don't get a lot. I mean, ISAR get a fair amount of publicity with the deployments we've had over the last few years, but members of the public, and this is what I always say about the fire service, we're not very good marketing. We don't. That's the sad truth of why the podcast kind of started. Is we don't talk about. We get plenty of bad press. We don't talk about how incredibly resilient, well organised, supported, funded, and just how technically proficient and well trained so many of our individuals are that are constantly on standby for the worst case scenario of any member of the UK. I think it's truly overwhelming. And like you say, your exposure and insight into that when you stood back holistically and saw all of the gears and buttons and interchanging mechanisms start to take place is very impressive.
I've got to, and I'm not, when you look back at some of the, other instances, Bunsfield, etc., there's many examples of where the arrangements have worked, and I think it's not until you truly experience it for yourself and you start to feel that level of support wrapped around you in terms of what, because there is always a lot of anxiety around incidents of that nature. There's an awful lot that can go wrong, and there is always that thing around. Pete, you'll have experienced this, I'm sure, in your career. When you do a makeup, there is always a little bit of anxiety around. Have I got enough? Have I not got enough? I don't think I've ever not made up in my career and not gone, have I got enough? Have I not got enough? And I'm sure there'll be many people smiling as I'm saying.
You can always send them back. If the worst answer you get is you got someone out of bed, that's absolutely fine. I'll deal with that all day long. Don't worry about it.
Exactly, but you're right. It's something that UK Fire and Rescue Service should be incredibly proud of because, as you said, the National Resilience Team do a fantastic job of keeping that there when needed.
I want to be respectful of you. We've spoken for over 2 hours already, and I know there's so many things where I'd actually love, and I don't say this to all of our guests, I'd love to have you back on, because I know there's a number of great things that we've spoken about, but also we've not yet spoken about. But I also want to keep it digestible for people. Sometimes you feel like, and I certainly feel like this, it's quite an overwhelming university of knowledge, having many great guests, yourself included, on the podcast. So I want to try and keep it digestible for people in terms of the content, because I know we've gone into so many great areas. People have to listen back to this quite a few times. You've gifted us with a lovely, you're perhaps one of the best prepared guests I've ever had, probably because I've failed at organising this twice.
You've taken it well, Peter.
So you've got time to go back and polish it. But you've gifted us with a lovely list of development books that you found tremendously useful. Some of my favourites that I can see amongst them. Some with really provocative titles as well. Surrounded by Narcissists, Thomas Erickson's one of my really great ones. Toxic Positivity. We spoke about that today, didn't we, to be fair? Simon Sinek makes an appearance in there. Leaders Eat Last is a great one. We had Peter Apps on the podcast as well, Show Me the Bodies. Really great book. I love the first 8 pages as well. Really grabs you, doesn't it?
Book had
we are going to make these available for people.
I mean, that book, for anybody that's involved in decision making about risk management, it had a profound sort of impact on me, that book, and I thought I understood, technical fire safety reasonably well. No, I think until you read that book, I think, absolutely highly recommend it.
He brings a dry subject absolutely to life, and he's put the hard yards in speaking to people that perhaps are not the most engaging or used to engaging with someone from outside the sector as well. Peter Apps is not part of the Yorkshire Fire and Rescue Service. He's a trained media person working for a buildings regulation style magazine. So I'm sure people were nervous speaking to him, but he's done an absolutely fantastic job there. We are going to make these. We're in the process of putting together a reading list, because I make the mistake of talking to so many people like yourself, and we mention so much great stuff. I always fail to put the notes in the bottom of it, and people go, I thought you said you put the notes in the thing, can't find them. So I'm going to put these ones in there, but I also would love to have you back on. Is there any closing points, closing remarks, loose ends you'd like to tidy up from the things we've discussed so far? And I know there's a whole lot here that I might even reference some of this actually as sort of my closing point when I wrap this up and come to editing it, things to stick a pin in for future conversation. But is there anything you'd like us to go on? And we are going to make a contact detail either through your LinkedIn or however you feel is most appropriate for people to get greater clarity on some of the experiences and lessons you've learned.
Yeah, I'll be both. I mean, I'm on Twitter, LinkedIn. If anybody wants to get in touch, more than happy to have that. But thank you, firstly, just Pete, for your time and the opportunity to come on. I think reflecting on a 31-year career across 2 fire and rescue services, it's quite something. And I think it's not until you do have that time to think that you actually start to really sort of reflect on some of the experiences that you've had.
I also think it's offensive of us to try and encapsulate it within I don't know how people do 5-minute interviews. I'm terrible at it. I'm terrible at in promotion interviews, because I tend to just want to get into so much detail. And I always say to people, and we didn't say it before we started, but we're going to fail today, because we're going to try to, and you'll listen back to this and think, God, we didn't go here, we didn't go there. But that's why I'd love to have you back on. But sorry,
it would be an absolute pleasure. Thank you, and I hope listeners find it enjoyable in some way. I think for me, maybe just something to take away. Something for me, if in any way anything that we've discussed sort of inspires people to be the best they can be in the job at whatever level that may be, either to develop themselves through the roles, or to stay at whatever level they. I've worked with some fantastic people. I learnt my trade from some fantastic firefighters who were firefighters all their career. I have the utmost respect for that. Whatever level you want to be at in the fire and rescue service, be the best you can. And I think for me, just do not forget the difference that you make to people's lives every day. And I'll go back to the point I made around, every day there are people that do some very compassionate, very courageous, very professional things day in, day out that will have an impact on people's lives for the better. And I think it's an absolute privilege to be able to do that. And whatever challenges are thrown at the fire sector, and I'm sure there will be many over the coming years, just keep that sense of perspective around that, be proud to be part of the UK Fire and Rescue Service, because it really is something to be proud of.
100%, brother. Couldn't have said it better myself. Carl, thank you so much for your time, mate. Some love to the family, and I sincerely look forward to having you on again in a number of months.
Likewise, Pete. All the best. Thank you.
The Firefighters podcast was created to recognize, acknowledge, inspire, and hopefully even motivate these incredible individuals who have chosen to be part of the first responder community. Our driving purpose is to create a legacy resource for the current and future generations of firefighters and first responders. We get some incredible feedback from listeners and guests, and as the podcast grows, our desire to create longevity and sustainability means that we are asking for the support of our listeners. If you want to support the podcast, if you want to get discounts to our merchandise, hoodies, clothing, coins, patches, tallies, and also access to all of the incredible documents that get shared with us from our podcast guests and sector leaders, then please head over to our Patreon page, and for just £3 a month, you can support the future of the podcast. Please finally hit that follow, subscribe, or rate button on the platform you're listening, and wherever you're in the world, please support your emergency services responders, and thank you for listening.